So for those who don't know Ken, he is the Collections Access Manager at the Egypt Centre, and his association with the museum first began in the year 2000 as a volunteer. And over the past 2 decades, he has been researching the collection and is particularly interested in tracing the acquisition history of the objects. And prior to his appointment as the Collections Access Manager, he was a lecturer in Egyptology at Swansea University. So really looking forward to hearing your talk, Ken. And just for those who might follow him on Twitter, his Twitter handle is @Dr. Ken Griffin. So I'll hand over to you, Ken. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Emily. Well, today I'm not going to be talking so much about the Egypt Centre itself, but the vast collection of Egyptian antiquities which were gathered together by Sir Henry Wellcome. As have already been illustrated by Ruth in her talk earlier today, Egyptian iconography is very much in use in Wellcome logos, as you can see with 3 of the ones which are on the screen today. So no matter where you went with the Wellcome collection, you would often see Egyptian material or Egyptian logos, etc. And that was the same in the museum itself. Egyptology was always part of the display in the various different manifestations of the museum throughout the years. I think this is the later display which Ruth was talking about in her talk earlier today. But where did Wellcome get his Egyptian objects from? Well, there are 4 main sources. There's the auctions, which were also mentioned by Ruth earlier. And this is perhaps where the majority of the collection of Sir Henry Wellcome was coming from. Over the course of 30 to 40 years, he sent agents to buy vast amounts of Egyptian objects, as well as other objects from different cultures. He also purchased objects privately from individuals, or perhaps at antique shops. And later on, I'll be showing you a list of objects that he purchased in Cairo in 1911. And then various people donated objects to the museum, the Wellcome Museum of Medical History, as it was called. Of course, there's also excavations. And we know that Wellcome was quite a good sponsor of excavations over the course of 30 years. To various institutions such as the Egypt Exploration Society, which you'll be hearing Stephanie talk about directly after my talk. And on the right-hand side, you can see a list of some of the objects which were acquired by the museum in 1931, which originated from the Egypt Exploration Society's excavations from the 1930 to 31 season, which Stephanie will be talking about a little bit later. He also received objects from the Egyptian Research Account. Petrie was mentioned earlier in terms of the papyrus by Ruth, or Garstang's excavations at Merowe, which I'll be coming on to in a little bit. The Oxford excavations of Nubia, as well as Caton Thompson's Carriga excavations, to name just a few. And as a financial donor to these institutions, he would receive a portion of the finds. But with the auctions, it's very difficult to know exactly when he first started purchasing Egyptian items. The earliest one that I've been able to find so far is in July 1905. You can see the lot items with a tick next to it, such as the one up here, where we have some Egyptian items that were purchased at this time. The following year, in 1906, though, he starts collecting enormously, I would say, in terms of the Egyptian material, and especially with the sales of the Robert Dura-Staffiel collection. There were numerous sales of his collection in 1906, 1907, and 1913, all of which took place in London by Sotheby's, as well as further sales that took place in Paris and New York, which I won't mention. Staffiel is quite a mysterious character, a British-American collector, dealer, and author, who changes his surname multiple times throughout his life. He was Robert Smith, Robert Focus Smith, Colonel Prince Roman Orbaliani, as well as, of course, Robert Dura-Staffiel, and many different spellings to his surnames. Not only does he change his name, but he's quite mysterious in the fact that there's no photographs of him. We know very little about his life. He seems to have been a geologist, a mining engineer, as well as the owner of the Luxor Trading Company in Egypt. And this is no doubt how he was able to acquire such a large, extensive collection, or collections, I should say, of Egyptian antiquities, with the first one being perhaps the most remarkable of all. What is especially important about these seals, the Rastafel ones, is that he will often include a large amount of plates illustrating the objects that he had for sale. This was not common practice 110, 120 or so years ago. So here's an example of one of the plates from the 1906 sale, plate 8, where you have 15 reliefs which were taken from Theban wall paintings. Now, over the last few years, I've been trying to trace a lot of these objects to the different museums they are today. And I was quite fortunate that I was able to find all of these pieces, which, as you can see from the left-hand side, are now scattered in a variety of different museums throughout Europe. And we know that very soon after the collection was purchased by Wellcome, or his agents, that Mr. Boscawen, who was mentioned earlier, set about cataloguing these objects and going through them. These are just brief notes that were made in correspondence between Thompson and Wellcome in 1907, early 1907. And you can already see that Boscawen is quoted here as saying that he's gone through the painted linen and textiles. Some of the latter are better than the British Museum in South Kensington. So he assumed that this collection of Coptic textiles, etc., is of extreme importance. While on the right-hand side, you've got Boscawen mentioning several pieces which are of great importance or significance to him. He mentions a prehistoric boat modelled in terracotta, likely an object that we have in the Egypt Center collection. And likewise, a prehistoric vase with finely drawn animals on it. But if we look in the next section, we have a comment by Mr. Thompson, in which he talks about making Boscawen describe every object as fully as possible, including the hieroglyphic inscriptions, which he can decipher. And by this point, you're talking only a month after the auction itself, he has already described 630 pieces from the Rastafel sale. Now, Ruth has already provided a background on Boscawen, who I must say is someone I'd never heard of until just a few years ago, but he appears everywhere with the early Egyptian material in the Wellcome. There's various lists that exist, or at least partial lists, showing that he clearly catalogued the Rastafel 1906 and 1907 seals, the Merowe material, seemingly from 3 Seasons, the Hilton Price 1911 sale, most likely the Lady Mew collection in 1911, Wellcome's private purchases in 1911 in Cairo, the Kennard collection in 1912, as well as miscellaneous lists of objects, such as medical implements from Egypt or amulets. So let's look at some of these lists and the association of Boscawen. Boscawen kindly put his own labels on the objects, which might make it possible to trace these objects further. And this is certainly something for curators that are on this conference today, working on Egyptian material from the Wellcome distribution, to look out for. These rectangular serrated labels that you see up the top are found on objects from the 1906 sale of Rastafel, whereas the 2 labels down here, the circular serrated and the rectangular one with the blue frame, they all seem to be related to objects from the 1907 sale. And from the photograph from Liverpool Museum on the right-hand side, you can see that it's been written here, Boscawen's number 311. This is likely to have been added by David Dixon, who was mentioned earlier. Some of the Egypt Center objects still have these labels on them, which helps us to identify them as being Rastafel pieces. Although here we still have the auction number, which obviously helps at the same time. But others, unfortunately, are orphaned from their objects. There's just a selection on the right-hand side. They were initially from Rastafel objects, but we don't know which ones anymore. In total, we have at least 500 objects in the Egypt Center collection coming from Rastafel, and potentially as many as 1,000, especially when you count all of our textiles and flints. He also compiled a list of objects that were purchased by Wellcome in July 1911, and you can see that he's added his initials up the top, WSCB. In addition to that, labels were added to these objects, around about 230 to 40 objects. As you can see, the sticker down the bottom has Caro 110, and another one has 148A, both objects which are in the Egypt Centre. And while many of these are small items, there are also some larger and significant pieces. This is a scribal statue belonging to an official called Amenemope of the middle of the 18th dynasty, around 1400 BC. And it's item number 2 in the list. Now, although there was no sticker on this item itself, it's clear from the description, having gone through this list, that this is the item in question. In 1911, he made a list of the objects in the Hilton price sale, perhaps one of the most important private collections ever sold at auction. Over 5,000 items, and Henry Wellcome purchased no less than 600. Boscawen was employed to create a list of these items, to catalogue them. You can see a page of his catalogue on the right-hand side, or his list. And not only does he give a brief description, he also gives his own new sequential numbering, as well as noting the lot. In this case, we have lot number 941, and the original Hilton price number that you have in his published versions. Now, in this vessel from Liverpool Museum on the right-hand side, you can see we have a sticker saying HP 530. That is Boscawen's own label, which he stuck to the item and can be then traced in the list that he produced, with the number being on the left-hand side. He made lists of the Merowe material, although these don't really seem to have existed or exist much anymore. I've only been able to find 2 pages in the Wellcome archives. Here's one on the right-hand side. And in particular, down at the bottom, this mentions a card of model bronze tools, probably a foundation deposit. Well, in the Egypt Centre, we have these model bronze tools, and they came with this label, model implements in bronze. So although we didn't have really any context to them, it seems from this list, the fact that it says Merowe 2 at the top, that this must have been from the 2nd season of Garstang's excavations of the site. And around about a year ago, I got very excited when I came across this note, which was composed in the 1980s by Georgina Russell, because in it, it mentions at least 5 volumes of a catalogue of Egyptian antiquities done by Boscawen or even Gaster, who was mentioned earlier by Ruth. So where are these mysterious volumes? Well, and you can see even further down, it mentions around 1,000 objects from the excavations of Garstang, which were coming from Merowe. So naturally, I was very excited by this and sent numerous emails to colleagues in the Wellcome Institute, or Wellcome collection, as well as the Petrie Museum, trying to find these without any success. There was no record of them until last week, when thankfully Anna Garnett had managed to locate not only 5 volumes, but 6 volumes of the Catalogue of Egyptian Antiquities, which was compiled by Boscawen. Here's just a few quick snaps that were taken by Anna at the time, but you can see that not only do they include descriptions and measurements, but they also include some drawings. So hopefully, when these are understood a little bit better, it'll be possible to trace objects in the dispersal of Egyptian antiquities, Egyptian and Sudanese antiquities, through these catalogues. And often, as we can have on the right-hand side, we have the lot numbers and so on. So these will really be fundamental for any of the museums working on the Egyptian material of Wellcome. I would really say this is the holy grail in terms of trying to look at the collection history of the Egyptian material. Keep in mind that this was produced before 1913, which is when the formal cataloguing process of the objects in the Wellcome collection was really undertaken. So this has taken place beforehand, and based on the various lists, I would estimate that this is somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 Egyptian objects that must be in these 6 volumes. So I'm really excited to see in these in the future. Another important collector that Wellcome bought from is the Reverend William Mcgregor. Again, one of the largest collections of Egyptian antiquities ever sold, at this time in June, July 1922. At this sale, Henry Wellcome bought no less than 1/4 of all of the items. So it just goes to show you how many items that he bought. He would often buy them at quite a cheap price, often amulets, small items, etc. Things that most people would probably see as being rather insignificant. But what's excellent about the Mcgregor collection is that a lot of the items have provenance from, which can be traced back to the auction catalogues. When the items went to the Wellcome Museum, they were documented, catalogued. As Ruth has pointed out earlier, there's this assumption that the Egyptian collection or the objects that Wellcome had amassed were never catalogued. That couldn't really be further from the truth. There are Wellcome slips, such as you see on the left-hand side, which gives details of the items, sometimes rather brief, sometimes more details. So while you often find them taken verbatim from the auction catalogues, what you can also find is that they provide much more detail than what you would expect to find or what you usually find in the auction catalogues. This is a stela that we have in the Egypt Center, for example. But one lot I'd like to highlight is numbered 1798. It's the last item which is in the auction catalogue for Mcgregor. And the description seems to suggest that it's nothing of any great importance. A portion of tiles, you have a quantity of silver, pottery, wood, stone, earthenware, and a large bucket. But thanks to the Wellcome archives, it has been possible to determine exactly what items that we have here. You can see down here, it simply describes a lot. In other words, it's not saying that we have 5 items or 10 items here. It's just simply a lot. They're not very specific. But using the Wellcome archival slips and the acquisition slips, the so-called flimsies as they're often called, you can see that we have a large bucket, we have the faience tiles, we have some amulets, bits of pottery, alabaster, handles, earrings, fish hooks, knives, uraei, and we even have a whistle which is mentioned. And I'd like to particularly highlight this whistle because this is an item that we have in the collection. So although it's not mentioned in the auction catalogue, you can see on the left-hand side the Wellcome slip which was produced for this item. It's described as one with a question mark whistle made up of alternate white and blue pottery rings on a tube. Now this item has recently undergone conservation in Cardiff Conservation Department, and it's also been analysed to show that it's made out of ivory as well as lapis lazuli, and it is quite an exciting piece which we're hoping to have back in the museum very soon. And then in 1959, David Dixon, who was mentioned earlier, got involved in the classification of the Egyptian and Sudanese material, which had seemingly all been kept together largely in warehouses at this point. He was a Welsh-born Egyptologist, and he was very much fundamental in getting the collection to come to Swansea, since him and Gwyn Griffiths had a conversation in Welsh in 1970, in which they talked about the possibility of part of the collection coming here. And he worked at the Wellcome between 1959 and 1964, cataloguing the material and arranging its transfer to the Petrie Museum in 1964. During this time, he wrote monthly reports to the director of the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. And here's just an example of the report for December 1959. These are often quite fascinating because they give details about the objects, the material that he was gone through. Already he talks about 22 cases of material that had been unpacked. Down at the bottom, he specifically mentions some objects, a 5th dynasty lintel, for example, which I'll come on to in a second. And then he says the most important items so far are 11 cases of Sudan material. This is the objects coming from Garstang's excavations at Merowe. And here we have the lintel of Chenti, which was mentioned in that previous report, which is now on display in the Egypt Center collection, and certainly one of our great treasures of the collection itself. When the boxes, or when the objects were placed into these boxes and crates from really the 1920s, if not earlier, it seems that they were often accompanied by inventories as to the items in there. So on the left-hand side, you can see case 6772 contains wooden figures. These are mainly wooden tomb models, and it gives a list of all of the items using their Wellcome number. Some of these lists still exist in the Egypt Center, and they've been really fundamental for us in order to try and trace objects that perhaps we didn't have any details about. So I've gone through this list and I've been able to find all of these items that we have there. But Dixon also made his own. Here's one on the right-hand side, which was clearly made in October 1960, as it says, seen by Mr. Dixon. Unfortunately, not all of these items have been registered at the Wellcome collection, and so sometimes they just have lot numbers or very basic details. But again, these are very helpful with determining items which may have come to Swansea or may have gone to other institutions if you have these labels. And what I'm very keen on trying to do is reuniting objects virtually. During the dispersal process in 1971, items were often separated from one another. And the classical example is this one between Swansea and Birmingham Museum. So while Birmingham Museum ended up with 2 Shabti boxes belonging to a man called Ptahhotep, the Egypt Center ended up with the 20 Shabtis that they were initially sold with in 1924. You can see we have 11 items for each lot, 10 Shabtis plus one box. So we have the Shabtis, Birmingham have the Shabti boxes. And there are other museums where I've been able to do this. For example, we have Swansea and Liverpool. On the left-hand side, we have 2 stone fragments. The fragment on the left-hand side is in Liverpool, and the one on the right-hand side, just here, is in Swansea. And you can see that they clearly belong together. And in fact, even checking the Wellcome slip indicates that when this was catalogued in the 1920s, it was one piece. But at some point after that, it had obviously been broken into 2 and being dispersed to 2 different institutions. And likewise, this seems to be the case with the fragments on the right-hand side here, which come from the coffin of Amenhotep, son of Hapu. This small fragment that we have down here is in Liverpool, while these 2 fragments, which have been glued together, are in Swansea, and they are direct join with one another. They can even be pieced together with other fragments, which are in different collections, such as Brussels, Grenoble, as well as a piece in a private collection in Stockholm. So this is a reconstruction of the coffin, the inner coffin of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, put together by Aidan Dodson for an article that we're working on for the coffin of Amenhotep. With the Petrie Museum, there are several objects that have been able to be virtually reunited. And these, certainly the one on the left and the one on the right, are both coming from Merowe. And I did see that there was a question in the chat earlier asking whether Swansea received any Merowe material. Here you can see clear evidence for that. The colour photographs, this one as well as this one, are in Swansea. This piece, as well as that piece, is in UCL, and you can see the original archival photograph taken from Garstang's excavation. The piece in the centre, we don't know where it comes from. There is a label to suggest that it comes from Merowe, but this seems to be somewhat out of context with the inscription that we have here, which mentions a chief steward of the god's wife of Amun during the 25th dynasty. And there's even some items that don't belong in Swansea that have been able to reunite, such as on the left-hand side, we have this vessel, which is in Cambridge Museum, while its handle, which had been broken off, was given to Bolton Museum. So one of the purposes of this conference is to really bring together colleagues from these different institutions in order to try and hopefully virtually reunite and better understand the material which has been distributed to these different collections. So how many objects from Egypt did Egypt and Sudan, I should say, did Henry Wellcome actually collect? Well, I've put this table together. It's obviously just a rough one in terms of figures, but you can see that it brings to a total of well over 20,000 objects. This is a substantial collection of objects. It doesn't include the Jebel Moya material, which could also be included in here, which would increase the number considerably. And again, we'll be hearing a lot about some of these museums over the coming few days. And I'd just like to finish off by thanking several colleagues who have been helpful for this talk, including Alexandra Ively and Ruth Hurry from the Wellcome Collection, Anna Garnett from the Petrie, as well as Ashley Cook from the World Museum in Liverpool. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. That was very much a brief introduction to the Egyptian collection of Henry Wellcome, which I think there's a lot more scope for the material, which you'll hear over the next few days.
Thank you very much, Ken. That was a really interesting talk, and really fascinating to see objects even virtually reunited. And I'm just keeping an eye on questions in the Q&A while we've just got a couple of moments. So somebody's commented to say, fascinating, impressive detective work and great news to have located the 6 catalogue volumes. Is there a list published anywhere showing the various labels used by different people for different sales, collections, etc., to help spot them?
Very, very good question. There's not, as far as I'm aware. This is something that I've been kind of doing myself over the last few years, where I've been photographing different auction labels and gathering them together into a folder. And I've certainly been sharing with a number of colleagues, and we've been discussing perhaps of setting up various workshops in which we discuss these different labels. There's a website that does deal with different excavation marks, the Artifacts of Excavation website, which many of you will know, and which Professor John Baines was involved in. That does have very useful tips on excavation marks, but in terms of the labels which are on items, there's nothing yet, but definitely more scoop for stuff there.
Thank you, Ken. And another question just popped up to say, have the Boscawen 6 volumes been digitized? Where did you say they are stored?
I wish they have been digitized. They haven't yet. I'm hoping that that is something that can be done. Anna Garnett is really the person who will be able to answer that question. I don't know where exactly they're being stored either, other than I would say the Petrie, but it could be just UCL in general. So hopefully Anna can perhaps post into the chat as to where they are now, but I'm extremely excited, as you can probably tell.
Yes, thank you, Ken. And I think maybe time for one more question. Can you summarise the difficulties of reuniting items in person? The more historically important pieces like the Amenhotep sarcophagus are no doubt impossible to bring together, but what about simple objects like that of a broken vase?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You very rarely see it in museums in which you do find them reuniting physically an object rather than doing casts and reuniting it that way. It's interesting that the Wellcome Agreement, which was signed on behalf of, by UCL on behalf of the Wellcome, it actually says that Swansea and Liverpool can exchange objects. So there is the potential. I'm not putting Ashley on the spot here by suggesting that we should change objects, but there is the potential certainly for Swansea and Liverpool. I don't know why specifically only those two are mentioned in there and not Durham and Birmingham. Maybe Durham and Birmingham because that was done at the same time. Maybe they had a similar agreement. I would love if Bolton and Cambridge would be able to come to an arrangement where the handle could be reunited with the vessel, but that is something that Bolton and Cambridge will have to decide, and they will both be talking to the curators in the next few days, so you'll hear more about that.
Thank you very much, Ken. If I